Now, we all know about the Magi who visited Jesus after his birth. Now, when I was growing up in church, we didn't know about Magi. We knew about wise men, because that's what the King James Version called the visitors from the East. And that seemed like a very respectable title, wise man. That sounds like the kind of people that others would look up to and seek advice from. But then there's the more modern term, wise guy. Now, wise guy is meant to be sarcastic. It refers to a smart aleck who's just annoying and full of himself. If you've ever seen episodes of the old Leave It to Beaver series, you have a perfect example of a wise guy. Wally Beaver's best friend, Eddie Haskell. He's the kind of guy who would flatter Beaver's mom in the kitchen by saying, "Your hair looks lovely today, Mrs. Cleaver," and then go right upstairs and verbally abuse Beaver. Now, you would look up to a wise man, but barely tolerate a wise guy. Now, I have no idea how the good term wise man morphed into the derogatory term wise guy, but that's just how language goes sometimes. But at any rate, the goal of Christians is to be wise men, not wise guys. And I'm not talking about wise men like the Magi, but rather men and women who live their lives in godly wisdom and grace. It's important that we demonstrate godly wisdom, not worldly wisdom. Proverbs 3:7 says, "Do not be wise in your own eyes." Because we all can declare ourselves wise and feel self-satisfied with that title. But what we as Christians need to strive for is godly wisdom, to be wise by God's standards. So that's what James addresses today as he teaches about true wisdom. And we see it in James 3, beginning with verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So James begins this section with a question. Who is wise and understanding among you? Well, that doesn't seem like a very controversial question, does it? If you attended a seminar and the speaker started his session by saying, well, raise your hand if you like ice cream, well, how many hands do you think would go up? Or if he said, raise your hand if you like puppies, wouldn't pretty much every hand enthusiastically shoot into the air? Of course most people like ice cream. It's delicious and refreshing. What's not to like? And of course, most people like puppies. They're cute and cuddly. Again, what's not to like? Those are the kinds of questions in which you expect an affirmative reply. I think the same thing is true about wisdom and understanding. If the speaker said to the group, raise your hand if you think of yourself as wise and understanding, well, I believe most hands would go up. Now, maybe not quite as many as for ice cream and puppies, but by far, the majority would answer affirmatively. I think some might even raise their hands even if they weren't quite sure it was true. I mean, what's the alternative? To be considered a fool with no understanding? That doesn't sound very good, does it? So I believe that everyone would think of some wise decision they had made recently, such as choosing to buckle their seatbelt before driving, or choosing to snack on an apple instead of a bag of chips. And they'd raise their hands thinking, of course I'm wise, I eat the apple. But true wisdom isn't quite that simple. In fact, James teaches that there are two kinds of wisdom. Wisdom from heaven, or what we would call godly wisdom, and earthly wisdom. And the interesting thing is that both are proven by our behavior. Those who truly possess godly wisdom will prove it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. And those who possess an earthly wisdom, they'll prove it too, by harboring bitter envy and selfish ambition in their hearts. That seems rather harsh, doesn't it? But to understand James' assessment of earthly wisdom, we got to consider the time in which he lived. James lived during a time in which the Jewish people were becoming more and more impatient with Rome. And so a sect was formed known as the Zealots, who actively and militarily fought against Roman domination of Palestine. Well, later, in AD 66, the Jews rebelled against the Romans to gain their independence, and the Zealots were right in the middle of it. They patterned themselves after some of the men of the Old Testament who loved the Lord and his laws and were ready to fight for them, men like Simeon, Levi, Phinehas, and Elijah. Their devotion to Jewish law and religion placed them in agreement with the Pharisees, but the Zealots went further. They thought it was treason against God to pay tribute to the Roman emperor, since God alone was Israel's king. And so they were willing to fight to the death for Jewish independence. The Zealots eventually evolved into a group of assassins known as Sicarii. And members of the Sicarii went around stabbing to death people who they felt were too sympathetic to Rome. And so their increasing fanaticism was one factor that provoked the Roman-Jewish War. The Zealots took control of Jerusalem in AD 66, and the Romans countered by laying siege to Jerusalem, and the city, as well as all of Judah, fell to the Romans in AD 70. The temple was burned, and the country fell. So the wisdom of the Zealots was to use violence in the name of the Lord. And some of the believers to whom James writes have been former Zealots. And they may have brought their violent ways into the church. And you can just imagine the problems that could create when some members of the church felt totally justified in fighting to death against Roman oppression, while others simply did not. When James writes, "But if you harbor envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth," the Greek word for envy is literally translated zeal, the same word in which the Zealots got their name. It can also be translated as envy, jealousy, or anger. So the word we read as envy may have been also understood as zeal to James' readers. And any former Zealots reading the letter must have known that James' words were especially meant for them. So some in the church had this violent passion, a desire to fight for what was right. And James identifies their drive as selfish ambition. In other words, this isn't what God desires. This drive to use violence in the name of God is a selfish pursuit, not a godly activity. And those who demand the use of violence selfishly push that agenda, even as it damages the unity of the church. And the sad reality is that those who adhere to this violent, bitter way of life did so proudly. They boasted about it. These were the kinds of people who were so sure they were right. They refused to listen to any other point of view. They loudly and proudly just pushed their violent philosophy, believing with all their heart that they were right. Well, James said that they need to admit that they are wrong, not to deny the truth. Because the truth was that what they thought was justified violence was actually driven by bitterness and selfish ambition. The violence they promoted was not righteous, it was sinful. James said that it does not come down from heaven. It is not wisdom given by God at all. Rather, it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So James describes this so-called wisdom in terms that go from bad to worse. This wisdom of violence does not originate from God. It's demonic. It comes from a very dark place. It comes from the devil himself. And where does all this lead? For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Now, we may think to ourselves, this passage doesn't really apply to me. I'm not violent like the Zealots. I would never think of killing someone to get my way. Well, although James may have had the Zealots especially in mind, it still has meaning for the rest of us as well. Envy and selfish ambition can easily creep into the church, with people promoting their own personal agenda, seeking power, stirring up disunity. And when that happens, disorder and evil prevail within the church. I was in a church once that was remodeling one of the rooms in the church to serve as a new chapel. That seems like a really good idea. And we were very fortunate to have a couple in the church who were contractors, and they volunteered their time to oversee the project. But some of the members of the church got jealous. And before long, this good project of building a chapel became a source of contention. And people argued and fought over things like how the room should be heated and cooled, with some just adamantly opposing a heat pump of all things, and whether the window of the chapel should be stained glass or something else. And these seemingly benign details led to heated arguments in the church business meetings, as well as unkind talking behind backs. And when James talks about the result of envy and selfish ambition, my mind also reflects on the state of our nation. The politics of America today are certainly driven by envy and selfish ambition. So much of what goes on in the political world has little to do with what's best or right for the nation. The United States is not so united these days, as both sides arrogantly boast about their rightness without any consideration for an opposing view. Instead of any desire to come together on common ground, the drive is for power and dominance, with an eye on just destroying the opposition. And what has this envy and selfish ambition brought to our country? Just as James described, it has led to disorder and every evil practice. So that's all negative. That's all bad stuff. Only fools and hoodlums are satisfied with a world of chaos brought on by envy and selfish ambition. In contrast, James says that godly wisdom is proved by a good life, by deeds done, and the humility that comes from wisdom. After all, isn't that a good description of the life of Christ? A man who went about humbly doing good? And when I think of a more recent example of a man who lived a humble life of doing good, I think of Fred Rogers, the creator of the children's program Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Fred Rogers influenced countless people during his lifetime because of his kindness, humility, and acceptance. Fred Rogers' respect for others was such an ingrained part of his life that he was appalled by guys like Soupy Sales, a popular children TV entertainer in the 60s, when he threw pies in people's faces. Well, Soupy Sales did it for humor. He thought it was funny. But Fred Rogers said, "I got into television because I saw people throwing pies at each other's faces, and to me that was such demeaning behavior. If there's anything that bothers me, it's one person demeaning another. That really makes me mad." So, what did Fred Rogers do with his anger? Did he lash out publicly against Soupy Sales and other pie-throwing people? Did he respond violently by beating up Soupy Sales or burning his house down? Of course not. He responded with deeds that came from humility. He started a children's program that focused on boosting self-esteem and helping children get through life's challenges. And who knows how many millions of people that Fred Rogers has helped by his humble kindness. James then describes this godly wisdom. And first, he says it is pure. And the Greek word for pure is also translated holy. This kind of wisdom doesn't come naturally in human beings. It's from God. We can't just manufacture it. We can't go to seminars and learn it. It's God-given. And since it's pure, that suggests it's also not to be mixed with anything else. This godly wisdom is a way of life, not just a technique to be used sometimes. This good, humble life is who we are all the time in every situation. And second, wisdom from God is peace-loving. And peace-loving is just the polar opposite of selfish ambition. Peace lovers aren't looking for a fight. Peace lovers don't go around stirring up trouble. As James taught earlier, peace lovers are slow to speak and quick to listen. They don't quickly jump to conclusions. They seek solutions and not strife. Next, godly wisdom is considerate. A person with godly wisdom cares about others. He doesn't speak hurtful words. Unwise people just lash out with all kinds of vile verbal attacks. Their goal is to win the argument. Well, they may win the argument, but they end up losing friends. Those with godly wisdom are sensitive to the needs of others and patient with them. Godly wisdom is also submissive. Now, the Greek word translated here as submissive only occurs here in the New Testament. It's not the typical word in the Bible that's translated submissive. And its literal meaning is open to reason. So such a person is willing to listen to another point of view. This doesn't mean we don't have convictions or strong opinions. Obviously, when the basics of our faith are under attack, we need to firmly hold our ground. But even Paul said that he was willing to be all things to all men, not to be so rigid with peripheral matters that people were turned off by the gospel. So truly wise people are not obstinate, not closed-minded. Wise people are open to fresh views on issues and change their opinions when they're wrong. Next, James says that people with godly wisdom are full of mercy. The wise person does not judge others. He's always ready to forgive others and never tries to take revenge. Godly wisdom is also full of good fruit. Now, the fruit that's referred to, of course, is not apples or papayas, but the fruit of the Spirit. And those godly attributes are present in the lives of wise people. And then, godly wisdom is impartial. People with godly wisdom don't take sides. They don't show favoritism. We remember that earlier James taught about the need to avoid favoritism with his story about the rich and the poor men coming into the church, with the rich man treated with honor and the poor man totally disrespected. So James said, if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. And finally, godly wisdom is sincere. A word we use today is transparent, that we're not hiding anything. Our lives are an open book. We don't just claim to be Christians, we live for Christ and live like Christ. James wrapped it all up by saying that if you plant seeds of peace, you'll reap a harvest of righteousness. In other words, you'll be on your way to right living, to spiritual maturity, to practical holiness. Wisdom is not something simply to be. It's rather something to be demonstrated by conduct and actions. Godly wisdom comes from God. It's a gift. And if we're going to live the way that Christ wants us to live, we need this gift. We need it to help us control our speech, to get along with others, to make appropriate choices, to face life's difficulties, to deal with lasting regrets and missed opportunities and past hurts and disappointments. We need God's wisdom every day. We need it in our church, in our homes, in schools, and government. We need it in all of life.